Phyrexia All Will Be One is going to be launching here on Arena on Tuesday. So threw together a little limited guide to help us prepare. First of all, let's quickly go through the mechanics of the set. First up is Toxic. You're going to see this on a ton of creatures in every color but red. Basically, it's just another way to apply poison to your opponent. Poison is when you get 10 poison counters, you lose the game. So creatures are usually going to be 1 or 2. This right here is Toxic 4, which is quite a bit of Toxic. There's also some mechanics built on poison counters and Toxic, and that is Corrupted. So when you get 3 or more poison counters on your opponent, they are corrupted, and then there's a lot of cards in white and green and black that get bonuses based on Corrupted. And then the last new mechanic we're going to see is going to be oil counters. These are in every color. Red has an abundance of them. Blue has a bunch. Green has a bunch. There's a couple in white, and then black has a few as well. And those are just going to function like ability counters that creatures come into play with. But Proliferate is going to be in the set, and there's going to be a lot of stuff to kind of move oil counters around and add oil counters onto creatures, so you can get some extra effects from those, or extra utility out of those oil counters. All right, up next, we have for Mirrodin. This is actually a new mechanic. I forgot about this one. But this is going to be on equipment, and basically it just means when equipment says for Mirrodin on it, you get a 2/2 red rebel creature token that comes into play. So these are kind of 2 pieces of cardboard here. They kill the rebel or with the equipment on it, and then the equipment sticks around. So you get some value there. And then Proliferate, like we talked about, this is a returning mechanic. And this lets you add any number of counters to any number of permanents or players on the battlefield. Lastly, Completed is back. There's 10 Planeswalkers in the set, 5 Mythic, 5 Rare. The Mythic ones are all going to have Completed on them, and that's just you can pay for that Phyrexian mana with life instead of the mana cost, at the cost of 2 loyalty counters for that Planeswalker. All right, so those are the mechanics in the draft. One thing that we have to watch out for in this set is the crazy bombs. There's a few just unbeatable cards at rare and not mythic, as there's certainly some unbeatable mythic cards as well. But at rare is usually where the problem comes in with limited cards that you have to really game plan around, especially on Arena and Best of 1. So how that works is if you're like 4-0 in a draft or you're doing well, you're going to go up against better decks. You're going to go up against other 4-0 decks, and they're more likely to have these rares. So you need to game plan around them. This bomb here, the Eternal Wanderer, is just a one-sided Wrath, and then it sticks around. So it's pretty crazy. I don't think this should have been printed, even at Mythic for limited. Maybe it should have been like Commander set or something, but you do have to watch out for these bombs in this set. So you need answers. Now, Annihilating Glare is not the best removal spell. It's 5 mana to kill a thing, but making sure that you have answers to these bombs is huge in this set. And then lastly, Mechanical Overlap. We talked about some of the mechanics. Corrupted, Toxic, Oil, for Mirrodin. There is no overlap with for Mirrodin, but there is overlap with the first 3, Corrupted, Oil, Toxic, and with Proliferate especially. And so they're going to blend together in multiple colors. So you're going to want to try to get yourself into either Oil, a Toxic deck, a Corrupted deck, and then blend in some Proliferate so your cards synergize well. So look out for that mechanical overlap in the cards. They're blended in pretty well. All right, on to the colors. First up is white. I like to go over some of the uncommons, some of the standout uncommons. This is a Banisher Priest variant here, a 1/4 for 3 with Toxic 1, which is fine. And then when it ATBs, you get to exile a creature or artifact your opponent controls with mana value 3 or less. So this is best when it comes down early. And what white's game plan is corrupting its opponents. It just wants those 3 poison counters on them, and then it usually kills with damage. So this helps you get in early to get an early corrupted effect on your opponent. So this card I think is really, really special if you can first pick it. Next up is Porcelain Zealot. I think is maybe one of the best uncommons in the set. 4 mana for a 2/3 isn't too special, but at the beginning of the combat on your turn, creature you control gets +1/+1. Or if it's toxic, it gets +2/+2, which is massive, which is huge in limited. Turns all your toxic creatures into threats, and it has to be dealt with. This is kind of a combat professor on steroids, but I think this card is incredibly powerful. If you remember Combat Professor from Strixhaven. Last up is Ossification. This is our blanket efficient removal that every color seems to get at uncommon. So 2 mana for an O-ring effect, right? So that's super efficient, hard to deal with, and there's a lot of bombs in this set, and so this can take care of them for cheap. So keep an eye out for that one. Good first pick. And then our top commons up first. Now this is tough for white because I think white is so strong in its early drops, and it's such a strong color overall in this set. But I chose Planar Disruption because it goes in literally every deck. It doesn't care if you're toxic, corrupted, whatever. And it's a 2 mana arrest variant, and I think that's really powerful, really cheap. It affects planeswalkers, creatures, artifacts, so it takes care of the bombs in this set. There is a minor sacrifice theme. Of course, there's bounce effects, but I still think Planar Disruption is a worthy first pick. Up next, we have Incisor Glider. This card is insane. It anthems your team when your opponent gets corrupted. One of the main reasons to go down that path, and it's at common, so you can get multiples of these. Base, it's just a 1/3 flyer for 2, which is, not the worst thing in the world. It blocks a lot of 2/2 corrupted creatures, a lot of early drops as well. And then late game, when it turns on, it just makes combat impossible for your opponent. Lastly, I could have chosen a lot of different 2-drops, but I chose Duelist of the Deep Faith. This is kind of interchangeable with a lot of the other ones. It's 2 mana for a 2/2 toxic 1, and then when it's on your turn, it gets first strike, and so that makes it incredibly difficult to block if you're on the play. So I think this card is really, really strong, and it's a reason why 3 toughness creatures I think are more important in this format, just to be able to block some of these crazy 2-drops that white and black has a couple as well. All right, up next, we have blue. Blue is the proliferate color highlighted by Thrumming Bird, which is returning. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can proliferate. It's a 1/1 flyer for 2, so usually you can get in there. It's tougher late game when you have stuff you want to proliferate. So looking for ways to get it in is usually helpful. But if you can, this card is powerful. And then we have a massive 2-for-1. I really, really like this card. This is blue's best uncommon. I think it's 3 mana for a 2/3 toxic 1, which is whatever. It's fine. But when it ETBs, an artifact you control becomes a 4/4 just on rate. So you get a 2/3 toxic 1 and a 4/4 for 3 mana, which is completely bananas. So this is a reason to be blue. I'm not a big fan of blue in this set. I think it's an okay support color, but this card I would first pick. This card is insane. And then lastly, we have a card. There's a white-blue artifact deck. I think that deck isn't super real, but you're going to get a lot of incidental artifacts, and a 2/4 for 4 that filters you automatically whenever an artifact enters the battlefield. And it puts, if you're trying to stall and play a long game, it can put cards on the bottom of your graveyard on the bottom of your library from your graveyard, which is fine. I think it has some utility there, but blue is kind of slim pickings in this format. Let's get to the commons, so we can flesh that out. So Experimental Augury I chose first. I think this card goes in any deck that blue wants to be in because it wants to proliferate. It's an instant speed, anticipate effect. It's 2 mana. Look at the top 3 of your library, put 1 into your hand and the rest on the bottom. Then you proliferate. So I think this card is super solid. You can play multiples of it. It's useful at any part of the game if you're just trying to dig for land. Early game, just fire it off. Late game, it can proliferate and find your bomb or something, or dig for something you need an answer. So I think this card is just super solid, and you'll play any amount of them. Up next is Ichor Synthesizer, 2 mana for a 1/3. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it, and then when it has 4 or more, it gets +2/+0 and can't be blocked, so it's a 3/3 unblockable. So, for example, Experimental Augury puts 2 oil counters on this, right? 1 for being a non-creature spell, and then you proliferate onto it. So if you can get these going early game, It's really strong. It also has the 3 toughness to help block those 2/2 toxic creatures to help you from getting corrupted early game as well. And then lastly, we have Gitaxian Raptor, which is 3 mana for a 1/4 flyer. Enters the battle with 3 oil counters on it, and then you can remove an oil counter, give it +1/-1. So it can hit kind of hard for a turn or two. If you can proliferate onto it, it becomes more of a threat. It also comes down early, has 4 toughness, and then it plays well in the blue-red non-creature oil counter proliferate deck, I think, as well. So this card reminds me a little bit of Mistwalker from Kaldheim, so hopefully it can help hold the ground and stall for time while blue sets up and does what it wants to do. But this, compared to the white commons, not so hot. But that's the state of blue. Hopefully it's a good support color in the format. Up next, we have black. I really like black in this format as well. Of course, we get our cheap removal here with Drowning Ichor. 2 mana. Target creature gets -4/-4, and you proliferate. What's not to like? The only thing is that it's sorcery speed instead of instant, so you can't use it in combat, but it's still incredibly powerful, efficient removal spell. Next up is a Corrupted Engine. This thing can be clunky, but if your deck can do the thing, you're in white-black, you can corrupt your opponent really fast. You can start sacrificing mites, which is kind of a little theme that goes on in white, where they make these little 1/1, toxic 1 mites that can't block. You can get a ton of value off Chittering Skitterling here because you can sacrifice an artifact or creature to draw a card for free with Corrupted. You can only use it once per turn, but that's totally fine. And it's a 1/4. It can block as well. So I think this card is super good if you can get it going. And then lastly, a really sweet Proliferate payoff. Now, I don't think Proliferate is going to be super common. Maybe you have 3 or 4 Proliferate effects in a deck, but this might prompt you to get like 8 or 9 of them, because this is a crazy drain effect. It's 2 mana 1/3, and it drains 2 each time you proliferate. So if you can get this going with like a Thrumming Bird or something, you're in business. All right, and then top commons. So I think Anoint with Affliction is really, really powerful. It's a 2 mana instant speed removal spell. Exile target creature if it has mana value 3 or less, and if your opponent's corrupted, it just exiles any creature. 2 mana instant speed, exile a thing is insanely powerful late game, and then it does what you want it to do early game, which is kill your opponent's 3-drop to stop it from, corrupting you or something. Next up, I have Pestilent Siphoner. This is just to get in those early points of poison damage. 2 mana 1/1, flying toxic 1, just a baseline good 2-drop. For black. And another good 2-drop for black, I think, is Blight Belly Rat. It doesn't have evasion, but it's a 2/2 body for 2, toxic 1, so it might be able to get in if you're on the draw for a toxic, for a poison counter. And then when it dies, you proliferate, which is the other thing that black doesn't mind doing as well. So if you do get that first poison counter, this can add another one when it dies. Up next, we have red, which is quite different than all the colors we've seen so far. So it does the equipment thing. White has an equipment theme as well. This one I think is pretty good. 2 mana for a 2/2, right? You get your token, and then as long as it's your turn, equip creature has first strike and trample. The equip cost isn't too bad, and first strike and trample, even if it's just on your turn, is a really powerful effect. So you might put this on your fatty or a death touch creature or something like that, and it becomes really strong. And of course, we get our cheap removal, Rebel Salvo. 3 mana, 5 to a creature or planeswalker, and it loses indestructible. There's also a very minor theme of affinity for equipment in red. There's a big gorilla that's a 7/5 trample for 7 with affinity for equipment, and then this as well. So that's a nice little bonus if you can take off, a mana or something on this as well. And then the other thing is that red seems to be all in on oil. A lot of the creatures have oil or ways to add oil, remove oil, use oil. So Churning Reservoir, if you can get this down early, I think is an awesome engine. It puts an oil counter on another non-token artifact or creature you control every turn. And then you can tap 2 in the card to make a 1/1 goblin token if an oil counter was removed from a permanent, or if a permanent with an oil counter on it was put into a graveyard this turn. And to note, the permanent doesn't have to be able to use oil counters for you to put them on them, so you can put an oil counter on your little goblin token, and when that dies, you get to make another goblin token. So it's a nice little engine. All right, top commons. Hex Gold Slash, 1 red, instant speed, deals 2 to a creature. If it's toxic creature, it deals 4. So this is awesome. A lot of the creatures that are threats in this set are toxic. So it's just going to be 1 mana, deal 4 at instant speed a lot of the time when you need it, which is amazing. Next up, we have Volt Charge, another standard, very strong damage spell for red. This goes face as well. 3 mana, instant speed, 3 to any target, and you proliferate, so you can get some oil counters on your stuff as well, which is really sweet. And then lastly, I have Kuldotha Cackler. I think since red is so all in on oil, you're going to have oil creatures and permanents with oil on them. No matter what type of red deck you're playing, and it's a 3 mana 2/3 trampler, and it gets +X/+O, which is the number of permanents you control with oil counters on them. And so it's very, very easy for this thing to be attacking as a 4/3 at least on in any red deck. Last up, we have green. Big slow, big value, incubation sack. I do like this card. I think it's sweet. It is very slow, but it comes into play with 3 oil counters on it for 1 mana artifact. So it starts the oil stuff early if you can proliferate. And then tap 4 on the card, remove an oil counter from it, and you get a 3/3 golem. So just on rate, you get 9 power and 9 toughness over 3 creatures on this thing. Like I said, very slow. But if you can add oil counters on it, or even just use a couple of these, that's just huge value. Because a 3/3 is going to trade for something, or it's going to get in for damage. Next up, we have a good Toxic Beater. 4 mana, 4/4, Toxic 3. Your opponent can only take 10 poison counters. So if this gets in once, that's automatic corrupted on your opponent. And then when it ETBs, you can pay 2 to proliferate. So it kind of does everything green wants to do, which is toxic and proliferate. There are a few oil counter things in green too. Green kind of dips its toe into everything. And then lastly, we have another equipment for Mirrodin. 6 mana for a 2/2 that gets +4/+4 in trample. So 6 mana for a 6/6 trampler, Colossal Dreadmaw. Fine card already. And then equip cost is insane at 7, but it turns any creature you have into a gigantic threat. I think this card is very good, and it will end games, especially like stalled out games. So green-black or green-blue that is trying to just stall and slow down the game, you drop a battle chair, and it's just going to take over. All right. Top commons. First off, I think Contagious Vorak is maybe the best common in the set. It's 3 mana for a 3/3. When it ETBs, you'll get the top 4, grab a land from them. If you don't, you get to proliferate. So it's amazing either way. There's a great failsafe. If you can get the land, which is what you usually prefer in most scenarios, it's just incredible. It's just a 2-for-1. It reminds me a little bit of Cyril's Packmate. Not quite that insane, but still incredibly powerful. Next up, we have Oil Gorger Troll, 5 mana for 3/4. When it ETBs, you gain 3 life. And then if you control a permanent with an oil counter on it, you draw a card. So if you can do the thing, if you can draw the permanent, this card is incredibly powerful. You gain 3, draw a card. It helps extend the game. It's a 3/4 that's going to trade. 4 toughness is very important in this format as well. So I think this card is just very strong if you can do the thing. And usually green can do the thing. It has a fair amount of oil permanents. Maybe not in green-white. This wouldn't be as good. And then lastly, we have Ruthless Predation. It's a 2 mana fight spell, but your creature gets +2 or +1/+2, which is often the difference between being able to kill a creature and survive or not. It also enables you to kill a creature and then attack as well. So I think this card is quite nice. Even though it's sorcery speed, it's still pretty good. All right, on to Colorless. There's an Oil Lord, which I think is going to be pretty sweet. It's 2/3 for 3 creatures you control with oil counters on them get +1/+1. And when a creature ETBs that has oil counters, you get an extra oil counter. So that's pretty huge. Next up, we have Fixing this Prophetic Prism. I don't know how much you're going to want to fix. I think, typically green-blue is more like to splash around. I think there are some wedge elements to this set with Toxic, Corrupted, and Proliferate. So, you might be playing a Bant deck that's toxic and wants to proliferate, or an Abzan deck or something like that. So there might be a place for Prophetic Prism in certain decks. And then there's the draw lands. I think these are not high picks, but definitely on the wheel. If you see these, you want to pick these up for your deck. It just makes things efficient. There's not a lot of ways to filter cards. There's no mechanic in the set that filters cards or draws cards or smooths out draws. So these really help with flood, things like that. All right, so color ranking. I think white is pretty easily at the top here. The early game, the 2-drops and 3-drops, and even the 1-drops are really, really strong. And there's great corrupted payoffs. Next up, we have black, which has, you know, our awesome removal package. They have good toxic creatures, corrupted payoffs. It pairs really well with white, so I think those make the top 2 colors. Next up, I think red, which reminds me a little bit of red from Kamigawa from Neon Dynasty, because it's super focused, all in on oil. It has a really good removal package, I think, with Volt Charge and Hex Gold Slash. But it doesn't play as well with white or black, I don't think. And then green, really big toxic creatures. I think it's a really good support color for both white and black. It proliferates well. It has a lot of like the toxic 3 creatures and stuff, toxic 2, to help poison your opponent to death instead of just corrupt them. So I think green is pretty decent as well. And then lastly, we have blue, which proliferates really well, but I think their commons are just really, really unimpressive. So it's mostly relegated in my mind to a support color, but a good support color. All right, on to the decks. So blue-white is going to be the artifacts deck. Cephalopod Sentry, I think, is a strong uncommon. It's 4 mana for a star 5 flying. Power is equal to the number of artifacts you control. It counts itself, so it comes in as a 1/5, but often this will be a 3/5 or a 4/5 in a dedicated focused artifacts deck. For 4 mana, that's a huge threat. Affinity for artifacts. We talked a little bit about that. Now, white wants to make Phyrexian might tokens, which are artifact tokens. So you can get these anthem effects for super cheap in this deck, and I think that's the only place where a card like Plated Onslaught would be viable in a deck. So you should be able to pick something like this up very late if you're making a lot of mites. And then lastly, we talked about Unctus's Retrofitter. I think this card is amazing, but it does add an artifact creature to the board, which I don't know if anything really cares about artifact creatures, but this thing, of course, you're going to have a bunch of artifact targets for it. So, and then to support, we talked about Transplant Theorist as well. This helps filter through your deck to find your bombs or whatever you're looking for, your removal, your answer. Mandible Justicar, a good 2-drop for this deck. I don't think it's I think it's a serviceable 2-drop in any other deck, but in particular this, because it triggers off of mites being made. It's a 2/1 lifelink, which doesn't attack very well, but if you can pump it a couple of times and get in for like a 4/3 lifelinker or even a 3/2, it's really, really strong to have on a lifelink creature. And then Tamio's Logbook. I think this card might have a place. This would be the only place it would fit. But if you can get this down to just a blue to draw a card, that's huge, and that'll give you some incremental value. It's also an incidental artifact on the battlefield as well to help trigger all your artifact things. On to the next one, Selesnya, which is toxic aggro. This focuses on really, really getting in there and killing your opponent with toxic, getting them corrupted, killing them with damage. So this is super aggro. I don't think it really cares which way it kills. I think it leans more towards damage because of Incisor Glider and its signpost uncommon here, which is Slaughter Singer. 2 mana 2/2. It has Toxic 2, which is huge. Whenever another creature you control with Toxic attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. That makes me think it leans more towards killing with damage and getting your opponent corrupted. A Porcelain Zealot, which we talked about before, is an all-star in this deck, gives your creature +2/+2. I mean, there's nothing more to say. This just helps your toxic creatures get in. And then Venomous Brutalizer, also we talked about. It's just huge toxic damage. It corrupts on 1 hit. And then it proliferates if your opponent's at like 8 or 9 poison counters. You can get them dead real quick with a couple proliferate cards. And then what goes in support? So Viral Spawning, I love. This card's amazing. A great uncommon ingredient. 3 mana to make a 3/3 Toxic 1, which is already fine. And then if you get your opponent corrupted, you can flash it back, which is 2 3/3 Toxic 1s on the same card for 3 and 3. That's just incredible. Just an incredible uncommon if you can get your opponent corrupted. Flensing Raptor, we didn't even talk about this. This is one of the best 3 drops in white at common, flying 2/2 Toxic 1, which is already great. And then when it ETBs, a creature you control with Toxic gets bounced, so it gets flying, and +1/+1, it gets jumped. So that's just an incredible way to get Toxic or poison counters on your opponent. Drop your Slaughter Singer on turn 2, Flensing Raptor on turn 3, and you're in business. And then lastly, Tyrannax Atrocity. I think this card is actually sneaky good. It's a Toxic 3, 4/4 haste for 5. You can get this in once. That's huge toxic damage to your opponent. This can get them dead really quick. All right, up next. This is really a Corrupted deck. Orzhov focuses on Corrupted. It's white-black. I think they have one of the best uncommons in the set. Vivisection Evangelist, 5 mana, 4/4 Vigilance, which is fine. I mean, it's not great. But if your opponent's corrupted, it destroys a Planeswalker or creature your opponent controls on enter the battlefield. So this is a great card, obviously, to blink. It's a great card to return from the graveyard. And plus, it's a kind of a beefy Vigilance creature. Orzhov is going to try to kill with damage. But it definitely wants some poison counters on your opponent. Apostle of Invasion, I think, is kind of clunky, but if it has a place, it might be in this type of grindy Orzhov deck that corrupts your opponent. A 4/4 flying double strike will just end the game in a couple of hits, so this might be the only place where there's a spot in a deck for Apostle of Invasion, these grindy Orzhov decks. But I think it's kind of cool, and I definitely want to win a game with Apostle of Invasion. And then we talked about Chittering Skitterling before, but again, this fits in that grindy Orzhov theme. Get your opponent corrupted, gain advantage incrementally over time with creatures like Chittering Skitterling and Vivisection Evangelist. How do you support it? So I think Bone Picker Scourge is, again, a great corrupted payoff at common for black. It's a 2/2 flyer. It's a Windrake, but turns into a little bit of a Nighthawk as soon as you get corrupted on your opponent. It gets Death Touch and Lifelink, which is massive on a flyer. 2/2 flying Death Touch, Lifelink, great on defense, great on offense. Just a great card. Sinew Dancer. If you can corrupt your opponent fast, I think this card has a place. It's a tapper for 1 white. It's a cheap creature. It's a 1/1 for 1 white. Late game, even if your opponent's not corrupted, I guess you can, it has some utility. 4 mana to tap a creature is very expensive, but what you really want is to corrupt your opponent and get that cheap tapping ability. And then last we talked about Anoint with Affliction. So this is gonna corrupt if your opponent's corrupted. This is just a 2 mana exile anything. And with a set with this many bombs, and if you do get a sweet bomb, you're going to want to bring that back. Exile does have value. All right, up next we have Boros. This is the equipment deck. Really like Bladehold Warwhip. I have a feeling if you are able to get into this deck, and I think this deck's going to be open some of the time because people are going to undervalue the cards. I think this deck is quite strong. But for Mirrodin, equip abilities you activate of other equipment cost 1 less to activate, and equipped creature has double strike. So it's a 3 mana for a 2/2 double strike, which is already fine. It does have a high equip cost, but it just sits around. And when you do have the mana late game, if you're trying to grind out your opponent, you can equip it to a creature. You can Voltron, suit up a creature, and make it double strike and massive, and your opponent can't deal with it. So I think this card's really strong. And it also, a lot of these equipment do have high equipment costs, or equip costs, and this helps to lower that. It helps to mitigate that. And I think this card's going to be available a bit later than you would expect in most drafts, so you might even be able to pick up multiples. Up next, I think Hexgold Hoverwings is just a good card, and you would put it in pretty much any white deck. But it's 4 mana, equip cost of 3. Equipped creature has flying, and creatures you control that are equipped get +1/+0. So you get a 3/2 flyer for 4, which is fine. And then it sticks around and gives any creature that you want, +1/+0, and flying. So this is really good in any white deck that wants to poison their opponent, because it can give your non-flying toxic creatures some evasion as well. And then Oxida Finisher, 7 mana for 7/5, affinity for equipment, trample. So this card is obviously gigantic, and if you can put a Bladehold War Whip on this thing, you're just going to win the game. So I think this card is sweet. If you can get this down to 5 mana, it's fantastic. 7, even 6 mana is good with 1 equipment on the battlefield. I think if you're in this deck, you can often have 3 equipment on the battlefield, and then drop this for 4 mana, which is just gigantic. So that's awesome. I want to win a game with this too. And then we have some support cards here. So Bladegraph Aspirant, I think might be important in this deck. 3 mana for a 2/3 menace, which is medium, but equipment spells you cast cost 1 less, which is obviously amazing for the equipment deck. And then to equip this, it costs 1 less, and there's a lot of expensive equip costs, so I think that's relevant here as well. Leonin Lightbringer, I think this card is just fine. It's probably unplayable in non-equipment decks, but 3 mana for a 3/2 Ward 2. The Ward 2 is pretty irrelevant because I don't think you care too much, but it gets +1/+1 when it's equipped, and so there's some value there. 4/3 Ward 2 for 3 mana is pretty good. So, and then we already talked about Hexgold Halberd. I think this card's super strong. 2 mana, 2/2 first strike trample is just really good on rate for attacking for an aggressive deck. All right, Dimir. This is Proliferate Control. I'm pretty interested in this deck. I want to see how it does. I think Dimir has not been good since Kamigawa. So I'm excited to see if a Dimir deck is good. But Voidwind Hybrid, very, very strong signpost uncommon. A 2/1 flying toxic 1 for 2 is already great. And then whenever you proliferate, you can return it from your yard to your hand. So it's great on defense as well. Just a really, really strong uncommon. Storming Bird we talked about. If you're able to get this thing in, you're just going to win the game in a deck that benefits from proliferate. And we also talked about Scheming Aspirant, which is going to be perfect and find its home right in this deck. Some support cards. I think this is the only deck where Prologue to Phyrexia is going to be playable, because you're going to want that early poison counter to proliferate onto your opponent. This deck also uses some oil counters. If you get lucky and open a Planeswalker, it can use the loyalty counters, I'm sure. But blue-black do have some cards with oil counters, but they have a couple corrupted payoffs. And obviously the poison counters as well. So I think this is probably the deck that could use this card. Maybe green-blue as well. Experimental Augury, we already talked about. Fantastic card. I think blue's best common, but that's going to help you find, whatever you need and proliferate. And then I think this deck is also the only deck that can make use of this card. So you're going to need a lot of cards that are useful for this deck. Latent Pacts, which is good. But Gulping Scrap Trap, it's 5 mana 4/4, not good on rate, but this deck wants to proliferate your opponents to deck, so you don't really care about getting in with this as much as it being a good blocker for you. And when it ETBs and dies, you proliferate, and that's 2 more poison counters for your opponent. So I think this card has a place in this deck as well, and you should be able to pick Prologue to Phyrexia, Gulping Scrap Trap, oil synthesizers, or whatever they're called. You should be able to pick those up pretty late. All right, blue-red. This is another deck I'm interested in seeing if it's good, but this is oil and non-creature spells. Now this card seems clunky. It seems like your typical is it clunky signpost uncommon. I think it's pretty good though, because it has 4 toughness, which is huge in this format. But it's a 4 mana 2/4. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on it. Blue's also very good at proliferating, so you don't need necessarily 3 non-creature spells to get this. But you can remove 3 oil counters, you draw a card. Then you may discard a card. If you discard a non-land card, it lightning bolts a creature planeswalker. So that's a hugely powerful effect, of course. But being on a 4 toughness flyer, I think is important, and having this stick around long enough to use the ability. And once you can get one activation off this, it becomes awesome. You know, draw a card, lightning bolts, kill a creature, pretty good. So I think this signpost uncommon, um, hopefully it finds a place, and this deck finds a place. A Trawler Drake, I think, is fantastic in this deck as well. I think Trawler Drake is actually a lot better than I gave it credit for in this format. It's 3 mana for a flying 0/0. It ETBs with an oil counter, and it gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. So it's 3 mana, 1/1 flyer, which is obviously not good. But whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on it, and then of course you can proliferate those oil counters as well. So this card, I think, can get out of control, especially in this deck, but in any strong proliferate deck, blue-black as well. And then Sawblade Scamp, I love these cards. Kessig Flame Breather, and I forget the one, Mayhem Devil. No, I forget the name of it. It might have been Mayhem Devil in Midnight Hunt. But these pingers and cards that work with non-creature spells, prowess creatures. But it's a 1/1 haste for 1. When you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on it, and then you can tap, remove an oil counter to deal 1 damage to an opponent. And I think if you can get multiples of these, 4 in a deck, they become an awesome win condition. Even at 2, they become a threat if you can get 2 in a deck. But 3, and you should be able to pick these up. The only deck that's going to want these, the only deck, should be a non-creature spell deck. I think you're going to see some red-black decks maybe try to use these as well, but you should be able to pick these up late. And then also, since it's non-creature, Skull Bombs. We didn't even talk about Skull Bombs yet. There's Skull Bomb in each color. I think the blue one's the best, but they're all, I think, playable. But Skull Bombs are cheap non-creature spells. Again, equipment on the red side is also a non-creature spell, even though you get a creature token with it. But Skull Bombs are going to be very important for this deck as well. This one, you can sack it to draw a card and bounce a creature. So I think this one is pretty strong. Meldweb Curator. I think this card has a place in this deck as well. It's 4 mana, 3/4. It holds the ground, and then you can put an instant or sorcery from your graveyard on top of your library. It doesn't go to your hand, which isn't great, but you can still get your best spell back on top. And then lastly, equipment. Volshock Splitter is a non-creature spell, and it triggers all your stuff. So and it gives you a creature. So one of the problems with prowess or non-creature decks is that you don't have a lot of creatures and you don't have a lot of defense. So this way you can shore up kind of that weakness by playing equipment that comes with a token or any token maker. All right, Proliferate Poison. This is Simic. This is one of the weaker signpost uncommons, I think, because it's a 3 mana 2/3 flying toxic 1, which is fine. It's just a good card. But you have to pay 2 to proliferate when a creature comes under enters the battlefield under control, and that's kind of a steep cost. You're not going to be doing that probably on turn 4 after you play this. Playing a 2-drop in that, you probably don't want to play your 4-drop or more expensive, powerful creature to stabilize the board. So this might come into play more late game. Which may be what this Simic is trying to do, is get a few poison counters with Tainted Observer, and then stall, hold the ground, and then proliferate the opponent to death. We'll have to see. If you can get late game and get 8 or 9 mana, then this becomes really, really powerful when you top deck a creature, of course. Thrumming we see this again, but anything to proliferate and get more poison counters on the opponent. Viral Spawning, we see this again. This, of course, wants to poison your opponent, get them corrupted, so you can get some payoffs for that. Serum Snare, I think, is going to be good in this deck as well. I think this card is actually underrated right now. It's 2 mana instant, bounce a permanent to its owner's hand. If that permanent had mana value 3 or less, you get to proliferate. So I think this card is pretty strong. There's a lot of incredibly strong combat tricks in this format that this gets around. Mesmerizing Dose. When you're in green-blue, removal or getting rid of a creature is usually a problem. And this does that, and it lets you proliferate. Another one, Infectious Bite. I think this card's pretty strong. It's just instant speed, bite spell, and then each opponent gets a poison counter. So this kind of starts off the poison. If you're having trouble getting that first poison counter on your opponent, this kind of starts it for you, and then you can just proliferate from there. All right, up next we have Rakdos, which is Oil and Sacrifice, Charforger. I think this card is really, really cool. It's a 3-mana 2/3. When it ETBs, you get a little 1/1 token. And then whenever a creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard, you get an oil counter, remove 3 oil counters, and then you can exile the top card and play it this turn. So I think this card is really sweet. If you can activate it once, you're in great shape. Necrosquito, this is another really good proliferate target as well. But it's a 4-mana. It gets flyer. It gets 2 oil counters when it ETBs, and then when a creature or artifact you control is put into the graveyard, you get another oil counter. So it comes in as a 2/2 flyer for 4. Whenever anything dies, it gets +1/+1. And then you can proliferate onto it as well. And then we talked about Churning Reservoir. I think this also has a really, really good place in this deck because you're trying to sacrifice things. It creates little 1/1 goblins for you. It's putting oil counters on things. So this does everything you want. Some role players. Nimrazor Paladin is just an amazing card. It's a 5-mana 4/4 Toxic 2. So it threatens with poison counters and damage. It's just a big body. And then when it ETBs, you get to Gravedigg, a creature with CMC or CMV 3 or less. Stinging Hivemaster, this is 2 bodies for 1. This is another fine common in black, a 3-mana 3/2 Toxic 1. And then you get a Might artifact creature that's a 1/1, can't block, and it has Toxic 1. So you get 2 bodies for 1. And then Chimney Rebel, another 2 bodies for 1. I like this card as well in red. It also wears equipment pretty well. It's a 3/3 haste for 4, and you get a little 1/1 buddy with it. All right, up next we have Golgari. This is big poison. This wants to kill with poison damage. It has one of the weaker signpost uncommons, I think, as well. But if this thing gets in once, it hits for Toxic 3. So it's a 4-mana 1/5. It has Toxic 2. And then whenever a creature you control with Toxic deals combat damage to a player, they get an additional poison counter. So all of your Toxic ones hit as Toxic 2. And then for 3 mana, which is an expensive activation cost, I think, in this format, you're not going to have a lot of mana floating around. Target creature you control with Toxic gains Death Touch until end of turn, which is nice for this thing on blocks if you have mana up. But then, what are you doing with your turn, right? So it's kind of an expensive activation cost, but it's there. It's utility. It certainly makes your opponent hesitant to block this thing. So I think if you have a lot of mana, access to mana, this card can be really, really strong. And then if you have evasive toxic creatures, it's also really strong. Bilious Skull Dweller. I didn't talk about this. This is another super efficient toxic creature. It's 1/1 Death Touch, Toxic 1 for 1 mana. Really good target to bring back from the yard, to get in some good early toxic damage, get your opponent corrupted, all the things. Just a really strong utility creature. And then we talked about Venomous Brutalizer as well. This card is massive. Your opponent won't be able to double block this thing if you have Rot Priest and 3 mana out, because we'll just 2-for-1 them. So really strong. And then we talked about Blight Belly Rat. You're just looking for 2-drops, ways to start the poison stuff. This hits as a Toxic 2 if you have your Rot Priest in play. It proliferates when it dies. Helps to add to those poison counters. Siphoner, another good, really evasive toxic creature. If you play this on 2, your Rot Priest on 3, you're already hitting for Toxic 2. That's incredible. And then Atrocity we talked about as well. So again, haste, Toxic 3, just kill your opponent out of nowhere if you can get this thing in. All right, we have Oil Beatdown in GRUUL last up. Cinder Slash Ravager clears away all the mites. There's a surprising amount of decent 1 toughness things in this format, so I think this ability is actually pretty useful. It's a 6-mana 5/5 Vigilance, which is fine.
It costs 1 less to cast for each permanent you control with oil counters on it. So often this will cost 5, maybe even 4 mana when you're able to play it. And playing a 5/5 Vigilance on turn 4 is gigantic. It's just awesome. Oh, Urbres Anointer. I didn't talk about this card yet. This card is amazing in red, blue, red, green, any red deck with oil. 4 mana, 4/2. And then when it ETBs, deals X damage to any target where X is the number of permanents you control with oil counters on them. So it's just it can be a Flame Tongue Kavu, but usually it deals like 1 or 2 damage and pings something, kills your opponent's smaller creatures. Still a fantastic 2-for-1. Evolving Adaptive is another fantastic uncommon in green. You can drop this on turn 1 and your opponent can't deal with it. It gets out of control. So it's a 1/1-for-1 because it enters the battlefield with an oil counter on it, and it gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. And then whenever another creature ETBs under your control, if it has greater power or toughness than Evolving Adaptive, you get another oil counter. So being able to proliferate onto this thing is gigantic. Or if you're casting gigantic creatures like Cinder/Ravager, it's just going to get huge and out of control for 1 mana. And it gets you oil counters. Also ramping, red, green, big creatures, big bodies, likes to ramp, likes oil. It's a 2 mana mana dork. That's an 0/3, so it can block a lot of those 0/2s and stuff, those cheap, good 2-drops. And it gets +3/+0 as long as it has 3 or more oil counters on it. Whenever you tap it, you can exile a card from a graveyard, and then you get to put an oil counter on Armored Scrap Gorger if you do. I think this card is really, really strong. First pickable for sure. Kuldotha Cackler. I talked about this one as well. Really, really powerful in this deck when you're trying to beat down. And Rustvine Cultivator, I think this might be one of the only decks where this is relevant. But we'll see how useful this is. It's a 1-drop, 1/2. Tap, put an oil counter on it, and then you can remove an oil counter from it to untap a land. So it ramps you, and then it puts oil counters on itself, which is going to be relevant for a lot of the red decks. All right, that's what I got for Phyrexia. All will be one. This set launches soon. Super excited to see it. And then hopefully get some draft skis in. All right, thanks, Joe.